They thought she was nothing more than a quiet woman hunched over broken radios, lost in wires and static. But when the general's eyes caught the tattoo hidden beneath her sleeve, and the code name slipped from his lips, silence swept the entire camp. In that moment, everyone realized the technician they had overlooked carried a past none of them could fathom. Welcome to the story Scape, where ordinary faces often hide extraordinary legacies. Here we bring you stories of unseen courage, forgotten identities, and revelations that change everything. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? And remember, stay until the very end of this story, because the truth behind one hidden tattoo will leave you speechless. The camp was alive with chaos. Trucks rumbled across the dirt, their tires cutting deep grooves into the dust. Orders rang out, sharp and clipped, as soldiers jogged past carrying crates of ammunition, their boots beating a steady rhythm across the hardened earth. The sun hung heavy overhead, pressing down on everything with its relentless weight. And in the middle of it all, tucked away inside a communications tent, she sat quietly among the static and hum of broken machines. Her world was smaller than the chaos outside. A battered workbench, the faint crackle of half-dead radios, and her own calm hands. Soldering iron in one grip, wire in the other, she worked with a kind of mechanical grace. Most saw it as routine drudgery, the kind of work no one else wanted, the endless repairing of outdated sets that barely clung to life. But she never complained. She didn't curse at the stubborn circuits or throw tools when connections failed. She simply tried again, patient and unyielding. To everyone else, she was the radio girl, a civilian contractor, a pair of steady hands brought in to keep the comms alive. She had no insignia on her chest, no combat boots stamped with rank and dusted with medals. She kept to herself, spoke only when asked, and seemed content fading into the background. But the truth was, her silence was not born of timidity. It was born of training. The way she shut out the chatter of soldiers passing by, the way she could tune her ear to the faintest whisper of a signal buried beneath layers of interference. Those were not habits of an ordinary technician. They were the instincts of someone forged in shadows, someone who had once lived with the weight of men's lives depending on her voice through a headset. Hidden beneath her rolled-down sleeve, ink traced her skin in lines and shapes that told a story no one here could read. Most would dismiss it as some abstract design, nothing more than art. She thought she had buried that past long ago, thought she had left the call signs, the midnight extractions, the blood and silence behind. She told herself this new life, fixing radios, keeping her head low, was safer, cleaner, invisible. That afternoon, as she leaned over a half-gutted field set, strands of hair falling from her tie, she felt a shift in the air. The noise of the camp didn't stop, but inside the tent, something changed. The weight of presence. The kind of silence that only comes when authority steps into a room. Boots, heavier than the rest, pressed into the dirt floor. She didn't look up at first. Years of discipline told her not to flinch, not to betray awareness. But she felt it, eyes on her, measuring, judging. Finally, she glanced upward. The man standing there wasn't just another officer. His uniform carried the weight of decades, his shoulders straight beneath the stars pinned to his chest. The general. But his eyes weren't on her face. They weren't on the radio she was repairing. They were locked on her wrist. where the sleeve of her shirt had slipped just high enough to reveal a fragment of ink, a curve of black line, a piece of the symbol she had spent years hiding. For the briefest moment, his expression cracked. The rigid mask of command faltered, and something like recognition or disbelief flashed in his eyes. He stepped closer. The air seemed to thin as soldiers nearby grew quieter, their conversations trailing off. Even the crackle of the broken radios felt muted, as though the world itself was holding its breath. And then he spoke. Not her name, not her title, but the word she had spent years trying to forget. Her code name. A name whispered only in the dead of night, across encrypted lines, known only to the few who had fought alongside her. The sound of it was a blade, cutting through time and space, and with that single word, the silence inside the tent turned absolute. Every soldier who heard it realized the woman they had dismissed as just a technician was someone else entirely, someone they never should have underestimated. The word lingered in the air like smoke, curling into every corner of the comms tent. It wasn't just a name, it was a fracture in the reality they all thought they knew. Soldiers froze mid-step, hands tightening on toolboxes or rifles as they glanced between the general and the woman hunched over the radio. A few exchanged puzzled looks, silently asking the same question. Did he really just say that? She didn't move at first.
Her eyes rose slowly, meeting the general's gaze. For a split second, it was like looking through a tunnel back into another lifetime. Nights lit by the glow of screens in hidden bunkers, voices carried on encrypted frequencies, the tension of waiting for confirmation codes while men bled out miles away. That code name had been her lifeline then, and her burden ever since. The general's jaw was set, his eyes burning with something between shock and accusation. But there was also respect, the kind of recognition that couldn't be faked. He didn't see a quiet contractor. He saw her, the version of herself she had fought to erase. The younger soldiers had no frame of reference. To them, the radio girl was a mystery at best, a background fixture at worst. But the older sergeants shifted uncomfortably, as though they had just glimpsed something they weren't supposed to. One even murmured under his breath, "That can't be," before snapping his mouth shut. She lowered the iron, setting it carefully back into its holder. Then, with deliberate slowness, she rolled her sleeve back down over her wrist. The ink disappeared from sight, but the damage had already been done. The general had seen it. He had spoken the name. There was no going back. "Sir," she said finally, her voice even but heavy with an edge few had ever heard from her before. It wasn't a plea, nor a denial. It was a warning, soft but sharp enough to cut. The general didn't look away. Instead, he stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she and perhaps those closest could hear. "I buried too many good people under that name, and I never thought I'd hear it again." Her pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. The tent felt suddenly smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of his words. Memories stirred, faces, voices, missions she had promised herself she'd never replay. The tattoo on her wrist burned beneath the fabric of her sleeve, as though the ink itself remembered. A soldier at the back finally broke the silence, whispering to a comrade, "What's he talking about?" The word spread like a ripple, whispers feeding whispers, until the tent was alive with speculation. The general, however, raised a hand, and the murmurs died instantly. His authority was absolute. His gaze never left her. You can keep fixing radios for the rest of your life if that's what you want. But don't think for a second, I don't remember what you were, who you were. She felt her throat tighten, but she forced her breath steady. Years of survival depended on control of her voice, her eyes, her body language. If she let even a fraction of her truth slip, the questions would never end, and she wasn't ready for those doors to open. Not yet.
Outside, the camp carried on, engines roaring, boots striking, orders shouted. But inside that tent, time had stopped. It was just her, the general, and the ghost of a life she thought she had buried. And though she tried to focus on the broken radio before her, the truth was unavoidable. The past had just spoken her name aloud, and it wasn't going to stay silent much longer. The camp eventually quieted, but not inside her head. The rest of the soldiers went about their routines as if nothing had happened, though whispers still drifted through the night air. They didn't understand the weight of what the general had spoken. They couldn't. To them, it was just an odd name, a strange moment. But to her, it was a door she had sealed shut, suddenly blown wide open. She lingered at her bench long after the last of the chatter died down, the tent lit only by the glow of a single lamp. The world outside was filled with the hum of generators and the occasional distant laugh. But inside, she sat motionless, staring at the tools laid out before her. The soldering iron had long gone cold. The half-assembled radio still lay open, its wires spilling like veins across the table. Her sleeve had slid back slightly, and there it was, the tattoo. The black ink stood stark against her skin, geometric and deliberate. Most people who saw it assumed it was some kind of art, a personal flourish, maybe a cultural design. But they didn't see the code hidden in the lines. To the untrained eye, it was abstract. To those who knew, it was unmistakable. It wasn't decoration, it was identity. Each mark was a frequency range, each curve a signal path. Together, the design formed the insignia of a program that never officially existed, one whose name was only spoken in rooms without windows. They had called themselves nothing. To the outside world, they were just shadows in the static. Back then, she had been more than a technician. She had been a signal in the dark, the voice guiding men who were cut off, lost, surrounded. Missions lived and died on her ability to pull clarity from chaos, to bend broken machines into lifelines. When radios failed, when the world thought communication was gone, she was the one who made it speak again. When the last man had stumbled back into safe ground, he had pressed his forehead against hers in a silence so heavy it said more than words ever could. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. The code name he whispered was enough. It was the only time anyone had spoken it directly to her face. Until today. She blinked hard, pulling herself back to the present. Her fingers flexed over the desk, restless. She had walked away from that world. She had buried the name, the missions, the ghosts. This quiet work, fixing radios no one else cared about, being invisible in the corner, was supposed to be her refuge. But the general's eyes had stripped all that away. One look at her wrist, one word on his tongue, and suddenly the wall she had built crumbled. He knew. And if he knew, he would not stay silent. The flap of the tent rustled, jolting her out of her thoughts. She tugged her sleeve down quickly, hiding the ink once more. A young private stepped in, clutching a dead radio against his chest. His boots scuffed nervously across the dirt floor. "Ma'am," he said, his voice unsure, "this one's fried. They said you're the only one who can make it work again." She took the set, nodding without meeting her eyes. But he lingered, awkwardly. Finally, he blurted, "Ma'am, what does it mean, that tattoo?" The word struck her like a gunshot. Her head snapped up, her gaze sharp as a blade. The private's eyes widened, fear flashing across his face. He stammered an apology and all but fled the tent, leaving her alone again with the silence and the weight pressing down on her chest. She set the radio aside and stared at her covered wrist. The ink beneath her sleeve seemed to burn, as if it reminded her that the past was not as buried as she had hoped. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a beacon, a signal that had gone unanswered for years, finally picked up again by someone who knew how to listen. And the general, she knew, he had listened. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. She could almost hear the faint echo of her code name in the static of memory, whispered through time and distance. She hated the way it made her pulse quicken. She hated the way it made her feel alive again. She had promised herself never to return to that life. But the signal had been found. The ink was no longer hidden, and the general, she knew, wasn't finished. Not by a long shot.
Morning broke hard over the camp. The air was already hot, dust rising with every footstep, the metallic tang of oil and diesel clinging to the wind. Soldiers moved with their usual rhythm, shouting orders, hauling crates, checking weapons. But underneath it all was a tension that hadn't been there the day before. Whispers clung to the air like smoke. No one dared speak openly, yet every pair of eyes seemed to drift toward the comms tent where the girl worked. She ignored them, or at least she tried to. Her hands were steady as she dismantled another faulty set, but her ears caught everything, the way voices hushed when she passed, the way conversations cut short the moment she entered a room. The general's single word had spread like wildfire. Not everyone understood its meaning, but everyone understood enough. The quiet woman in their midst was not who they thought she was. By midday, the inevitable happened. The tent flap lifted, and the general stepped inside. He didn't bark orders. He didn't bring aides or guards. He simply entered, his presence heavy enough to clear the room of anyone who didn't belong. The few soldiers inside suddenly remembered urgent tasks elsewhere, leaving her alone with him in the dim light. She kept her head down, focusing on the broken circuit board before her, though her pulse quickened. She had spent years training herself to not react, to not give away what was happening beneath the surface, but the air in the tent seemed thinner with him in it. "You should have covered it better," he said finally, his voice low, almost conversational. But then again, maybe it was meant to be seen. She looked up, eyes flat. "I don't know what you think you saw, General." He stepped closer, folding his hands behind his back. "Don't insult me. I commanded missions that only survived because of you. I heard your voice in the dark, and I know that mark." Her jaw tightened. "That life is over." His gaze lingered on her face, as though searching for a crack in her composure. "Over for you, perhaps, but not for those who still carry the scars. I buried men who swore by the sound of your code name, men who said you guided them out when no one else could reach them. Tell me, do you think they ever forgot?" The words cut deep. Against her will, fragments of memory surged.
A desperate voice over a failing line. Coordinates rattled off in a whisper. The stutter of gunfire bleeding through static. The echo of someone murmuring her code name like a prayer before the connection went dead. She swallowed hard, forcing her expression into stone. I did what I had to. That doesn't mean I want it remembered.
The general studied her for a long moment, then moved to the side of her workbench. His eyes flicked briefly to her sleeve, where the tattoo was hidden once more. You don't get to erase that kind of service. Not from yourself, not from me. Silence stretched. Outside, voices shouted, trucks roared, life went on. Inside, it was just the two of them, and the weight of secrets buried too long. Finally, he leaned closer, lowering his voice to a rasp. Do you know why I remember your name after all these years? Because one night, in the middle of a valley no one's supposed to talk about, my convoy was dead in the water. Engines down, radios fried, enemies moving in. We should have been slaughtered. Her eyes flicked to his, startled despite herself. He nodded, almost grimly. And then your voice came through, calm, precise. You told me exactly how to reroute power through a half-broken set. You guided us through the pass, step by step. When I asked who the hell you were, you gave only one word, your code name. And I never forgot it. For the first time in years, her mask wavered. She remembered that night, the pressure, the cold sweat, the absolute silence when her guidance finally brought them out alive. She remembered collapsing afterward, exhausted, her hands still trembling as the signal faded. She had told herself no one would remember, that she had been nothing but a ghost in the static. But here he was, proof that ghosts had teeth. You saved my command, the general said softly. And you think you can spend the rest of your life hiding behind broken radios? No, that name means something, and it's not done with you yet. She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't understand. That name cost me everything. His eyes narrowed. Maybe, but it also saved lives, and whether you like it or not, it's about to save more. The implication hung in the air, heavy as a storm about to break. She wanted to deny it, to push him out of the tent and slam the door on the past. But deep down, a part of her already knew. Once the signal was heard again, it could never be silenced. By the next morning, the entire camp felt different. The routines were the same, roll call, gear checks, trucks pulling in and out, but beneath the surface there was an unease no amount of shouting officers could disguise. Whispers moved faster than the supply lines. A general did not call a civilian contractor by a code name in front of his men without consequences.
She felt it the moment she stepped out of the comms tent. Eyes followed her more openly now, no longer disguised by casual glances. Some of the younger privates looked at her with a kind of awe, as if she were suddenly more than human. Others looked unsettled, even suspicious, wondering what kind of secret a quiet technician could possibly be hiding. At breakfast, two sergeants at a nearby table hushed their conversation when she passed. She caught only fragments. Special unit. Tattoo. Not supposed to exist, but it was enough. The story was spreading, reshaped with every retelling, growing more myth than fact. Some said she was a spook from intelligence. Others claimed she had been part of a secret strike team that operated without uniforms or recognition.
By the end of the day, she overheard a young soldier telling wide-eyed comrades that she'd once single-handedly jammed enemy comms across an entire battlefield. None of it was true, and yet all of it was. That was the curse of the life she had left behind. The truth and the legend were so tangled that even she could no longer separate them cleanly. She returned to her bench, hoping to bury herself in wires and static would silence the noise. But the past had a way of seeping into the present, no matter how deep she tried to bury it. Every time her sleeve rode up, every time a soldier's gaze lingered too long, she felt the ink on her skin pulse like a heartbeat. Late in the afternoon, a corporal entered the comms tent with a broken headset. He hovered by her table, shifting from foot to foot. Finally, he leaned closer, voice low. "Ma'am," he said, glancing over his shoulder, "they're saying you don't just fix radios. They're saying you were the radio, that you had a call sign, that you pulled men out of places no one else could reach." She didn't look up, her hand steady as she soldered a wire back into place. "Rumors," she said flatly. "Soldiers will believe anything when they're bored." The corporal hesitated, then nodded and left. But she knew he didn't believe her. None of them did. By evening, the whispers had grown so loud they might as well have been shouts. In the mess hall, her presence turned heads. At the motor pool, men paused in their work as she walked by, as if to expect her to reveal something at any moment. Even those who didn't know the details felt it. There was something about her that no ordinary technician carried. When she returned to the comms tent, the general was waiting, alone as before. He stood by the workbench, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. "You hear it, don't you? The way they talk about you now, the stories." "I hear lies," I replied, sharper than I intended. "Lies," he repeated, almost amused. "Perhaps, but even lies have roots, and the roots are yours." She stiffened, glaring at him. "I left that behind. I didn't come here to be anyone's ghost story." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You don't get to choose what survives of you. You think you walked away, but the mark is still there. The men see it. They know it means something, and they need it now more than ever." Her breath caught, though she hid it well. "What do you mean?" The general's eyes were hard, but not unkind. "There's an operation coming, one that depends on signals, on coordination in the middle of chaos. I could order anyone to handle it, but we both know only one person can do what you can do." Her pulse hammered in her ears. For a moment she felt the old stirrings, the rush of focus, the clarity that came when the world narrowed to static and a single voice on the line. She hated how much she had missed it, but she shook her head. "No, that life cost me too much. I'm not going back." The general's jaw tightened. "You may not have a choice." As he left the tent, the flap swinging closed behind him, she stared down her covered wrist. The ink beneath the fabric seemed to burn as though alive, as though it had been waiting for this moment. The whispers outside grew louder, and she knew deep down that the general was right. The past wasn't just finding her again. It was demanding her return. The storm rolled in without rain, only heat, dust, and interference. By mid-afternoon, the airwaves were breaking apart. Transmissions that had been clean that morning began to stutter, then vanish entirely. Messages cut mid-sentence. Coordinates froze on tablet screens. Orders dissolved into static. At first, the soldiers thought it was a passing glitch. Comms always sputtered when the heat rose. But this was different. The noise wasn't random. It had a rhythm,
a pulsing distortion that slashed across every frequency they touched. Entire patrols disappeared from the net. The recon element in the foothills was gone, replaced by a wall of white noise sharp enough to make ears ring. Inside the comms tent, tension snapped taut. Technicians scrambled, twisting dials, slamming switches, shouting into dead microphones. The more they tried to fight the interference, the stronger it seemed to grow, as if someone on the other end was laughing at their efforts. She sat among the chaos, listening. Not to the shouting, not to the panic, but to the static itself. Noise had texture, and she knew how to feel it. This wasn't weather, and it wasn't equipment failure. It was a hand, deliberate and skilled, jamming them with surgical precision. Whoever it was, they weren't amateurs. They were baiting them, driving wedges into their net until it was on the verge of collapse.
And collapse meant disaster. A logistics convoy waited in the valley, blind without updates. A recon team sat somewhere in the foothills, cut off and surrounded. If they moved without guidance, they would stumble straight into an ambush. The general entered without warning. His presence silenced the tent faster than a barked order. He carried no aides, no escorts, only a hardened handset that he set carefully on her bench. His gaze locked on her, unreadable but unyielding. They move blind in 10 minutes. Convoys exposed. Recon is pinned. We lose them both if nothing changes. His eyes flicked to her sleeve. He didn't need to say more. She inhaled once, slow and steady, then rolled her sleeves to the elbow. The tattoo gleamed under the lamplight, sharp and dark. The room fell silent. Even the greenest private knew instinctively that this was no decoration. The ink meant something, though none of them could have explained it. The general gave her a single nod, not a command, not even a request. A recognition, permission. She moved. Kill the preset hop sequence. It's compromised. The jammer's predicting our shift. A corporal hesitated. Then, what do we use? She snapped open a broken set, her fingers moving like a surgeon's, bypassing scorched traces with wires stripped bare by her teeth, stitching a field rig together out of parts everyone else had written off. She barked instructions without looking up. I need a long line off the rear mast, counterpoise on the ground, 80 feet minimum. You, battery crate, double it, now. Men jumped to obey. The tattoo was more than ink. It was a memory palace of circuits and doctrine, every line a reminder of how to twist silence into signal. A curve for field balloons, a cross for low-angle launch, a loop for the frequencies that cut deepest at night. She carried in her skin the playbook of ghosts. The first lash-up hummed to life, faint but steady. She tuned it by ear, twisting a dial until the static's roar bent into a comb of peaks and valleys. There you are, she whispered, almost to herself. Then louder, we don't fight him head-on, we step around him. She keyed a dead channel, her voice low and deliberate. Foothill element, if you're alive, do not transmit, listen only. When you hear 3 short tones, then 1 long, break squelch for half a second, nothing else. The tent held its breath. She sent the tones, 3 short, 1 long. Silence answered. Then, faint, so faint, a tick. Half a second. No voice, just a breath on the line. Her lips curled. You're alive.
The men in the tent leaned closer, wide-eyed. She sent another instruction, building meaning out of silence and rhythm. Each tiny squelch tick became a coordinate, each pause a direction. She translated on paper faster than others could follow, sketching positions as if the mountain itself was speaking through her. They're at the third spur. 2 shooters east, 1 west. They're boxed in shadow. The general's eyes lit, grim and sharp. Then the convoy, she cut in, stays cold. We pivot. Feed the jammer bait so wide he can't resist. She lashed wire into a crude V, pointing it toward the ridge. We're giving him what he wants, a fat target, but we'll ride a reflection under his teeth. A sergeant frowned. It'll hold, it'll bounce, she said, and he'll choke on it. She keyed again, this time on a channel any jammer would leap to crush. Blue Sun Convoy, this is base. Stand by for route update. The response was instant, a flood of static so violent it rattled the table. The jammer lunged at the bait, and in that flood, she slid the needle. A thin whisper threading just under the noise, bouncing off sky, carrying instructions no enemy could hear. Foothill element, on my 3 break shadow, shift west, move when you hear thunder. The corporal blinked. Thunder? She didn't answer him. Outside, engines roared awake, the QRF rolling toward the ridge. The recon team answered with silence broken into ticks. She caught every one, building the escape step by step, leading them through the canyon without a word spoken. Time bent. The tent seemed to breathe with her, every ear tuned to the impossible thread she was pulling. Finally, a signal came, a pattern of ticks, clear and certain. They were out, alive. The room erupted in gasps and disbelief. She dropped the handset, letting it swing from its cord, her hands trembling only after the work was done. The tattoo glistened in the lamplight. A map, a memory, a promise. The general stepped forward. For a long moment he said nothing, only studying her with the weight of recognition. Then, in a voice softer than before, he spoke her code name. The tent froze. Soldiers straightened unconsciously, as if they had just heard the name of a legend. But she shook her head. That name belongs to nights when there was no choice. Today, we chose. The general's face shifted, something between pride and grief. Then what should I call you? She pulled her sleeve back down, covering the ink once more. Call me what I am, your comms chief, until the storm's gone. No one argued. Outside, the valley was dust and diesel. Inside, the air had changed. Men who had whispered now carried themselves differently, their steps aligned to a new rhythm. Hours later, the recon team staggered into camp, faces gaunt, uniforms torn, but alive. They didn't speak her name. They didn't need to. One of them simply tapped 2 fingers against his throat, the universal signal of comms. Then he raised them in silent thanks. She returned the gesture with a nod. By dawn, the jammer was silent, not because it couldn't speak, but because there was nothing left to say. She packed her tools carefully, coiling wires, labeling lash-ups. When the general paused at the tent flap, the first light catching the stars on his chest, he said only, "You saved them." She didn't look up. We kept the promise. He studied her a moment longer, then left without another word. Alone, she pressed her palms to the scarred wood of the bench and listened, not for noise, not for signals, but for the rarest sound of all. Silence, the kind that means everything that needed saying had already been said. And as she sat there, the ink on her wrist cooled to the temperature of her skin, and she knew the storm would come again. And when it did, she would be ready.